way is going to be behaving. We don't even know exactly whether it is going to be almost, have you seen the worst, and will it subside completely before the third wave starts again? So all these issues we would request Dr. Vidyasagar to address. And then after he speaks for some time, then we will have, I think, a Q&A session. So thank you, and over to you, Hari.
Thank you, Kali. Thank you very much for giving a brief introduction to Dr. Vidyasagar about the CEO Club and the context of this meeting. It's an extraordinary privilege, actually, to introduce such a gigantic personality. It's some fortune that I have done, that I have been able to introduce him. I want to start with the link between him and Albert Einstein. He and Professor M.V. Subbarao Garu wrote one paper together. And M.V. Subbarao Garu and Ernst Stoss wrote one paper together. And Ernst Stoss and Albert Einstein wrote one paper together. That is the kind of a link that Dr. Vidyasagar has with Albert Einstein. He has another link with Paul Altos, another famous mathematician. He and his father wrote, his father and Paul Altos wrote it. This is the kind of a genius that Dr. Vidyasagar is. There are 65 Indians who are members and fellows of the Royal Society of London. 65. The total membership is 8,000. The Royal Fellowship of Society of London was started in 1647 and it is continuing today. It has members Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, Alan Turing. These are the kind of members that are there in that fellowship. And amongst the 65 Indian members, Dr. Vidyasagar is a member of the Royal Society of London. Born in Guntur, my hometown. So I'm extremely pleased to introduce Vidyasagar because of that connection that I have with him. 1947, September 29th, he was born. And very quickly, between 65, he finished his BS, 67 MS, 69 PhD. He finished this thing from 69 to 89. He worked in the US. Then 89 to 2000, he came to India and he established the Center for Artificial Intelligence and Robotics. It's a government of India under the Defense Ministry. This was set up. He set it up. He worked with 80 engineers. And then he moved to TCS. He came to Hyderabad. He worked in TCS for 10 years. Then he went back to the US, worked there. And now in 2015, he came back to Hyderabad. He's working in Hyderabad. So that's the 52 years of his lifetime that I'm just telling you. But if you go to his resume and if you Google his resume on IIT, you would see the kind of work that he has done. He's written more than 13 books and he has presented more than 150 papers, peer-reviewed papers. So without any more delay, it gives me immense joy, pleasure, and a privilege to bring our own Vidyasagar Garu to the platform of CEO Club. I invite you, sir, please address us. Please tell us about COVID. What is the Sutra model? How did this come about? And over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for a very generous introduction. Just a couple of minor corrections, if I may. 8,000 is the total number of fellows that the Royal Society has had in its 350-year history. Right now, there are probably 1,500 living fellows. And similarly, 65 is the total number of Indians that have ever been elected fellows of the Royal Society. The first one was a businessman, one Parsi businessman, whose name I don't recall. But leaving him aside, the first Indian to have been elected as a fellow of the Royal Society was Srinivasa Ramanujan. So it's a very great honor and very humbling to be in that company. There are probably around 20 or 25 living Indian Fellows of the Royal Society. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to the CEO Clubs of Hyderabad. So let me just start with the talk immediately without delay, if I may. So I hope everyone can see this. So the title I have chosen is Sutra Model for COVID-19, Current Status and Next Steps. So I'm the speaker. I say typographical error right away. That should be National Science Chair. So this is a position I have at IIT Hyderabad. And this is the work of 3 people. The other 2 are Professor Manindra Agrawal from IIT Kanpur, and then Lieutenant General Madhuri Kanitkar from the Office of the Chief of Defense Staff. I'm very happy to see that she's also here on the call today. So here's a very quick outline of the lecture. I'll talk very briefly about what were some of the early models for pandemics and come right away into the Sutra model and give 2 sets of predictions. One is the predictions for other countries. I'm going to show you US and for US and UK, and then most of the time spent on projections for India, and then several slides on forecasting a 3rd wave. I have about 36, 37 slides. If you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. It's a very easy paced talk with a lot of graphs. And of course, at the end of the talk, you should have a Q&A as well. So what is the background of this Sutra project? So whenever I have appeared on TV, there has been a lot of confusion as to whether we are a government committee or we are still advising the government and so on. So I thought I should set the record straight there. So in late May of 2020, the Department of Science and Technology appointed a 10-person committee, and it had the rather pretentious title of COVID-19 India National Supermodel Committee. Believe me, we would not have chosen this title, but the DST chose this title for the committee. And the other 2 people, Professor Agrawal and General Kanitkar, they were part of the membership, and there were several others as well. So we integrated a bunch of ideas from the scientific community of India and submitted our report to DST in the middle of October. And after that, let's say from November 2020 onward, the committee really didn't meet. So the Supermodel Committee, it exists on paper, but it hasn't been really functional. So the 3 of us who are a part of the original 10 persons here, we published the Supermodel and we called it SAIR2. And this paper appeared in the Indian Journal of Medical Research. But it had certain shortcomings, which we knew about. So we continued working on our own. And this led to the so-called Sutra model. We deposited the preprint in January 2021. We have not yet submitted it for the journal. We'll be doing that by the end of June this year. And now, because of the onset of the erosion of immunity and the vaccinations going on at high speed, we are going to work on the next version of Sutra, which will incorporate these 2 features. So let me begin by early models. This is the famous curve of the Spanish flu, which hit in the aftermath of the World War I. And the point of putting this curve is to note the multiple peaks. All the damage was done in the second peak. And the first peak hit and it subsided, and remember, it subsided for a long, long time. People thought it was behind them. But then it came back with a vengeance, and most of the people died here. In those days, 14 to 15,000 people were dying every week. And if you consider that the world population was about a third of what it is today, that's approximately equivalent to 50,000 people dying every week in today's terms. A very deadly disease. People forget there was a third peak. People didn't pay any attention to this peak only because it was smaller than the second peak. But viewed by itself, it was a very dangerous peak because it was much worse than the first peak. Of course, back then, the techniques of molecular biology were simply absent. So the first mathematical model for diseases that are communicable was proposed by two people called Kermack and McKendrick in the year 1927. And ironically, they were trying to model the spread of the bubonic plague in the city of Pune. That was their motivation. So they wanted to understand, I mean, everyone knew that plague was contagious. That was not a big thing. But the question is, how does it actually spread? So what these people did was, they divided the society into three groups. S stood for susceptible, I stood for removed, so it includes both the recovered people as well as the deaths. Obviously, in the case of the plague, deaths were very, very dominant. As we shall see in the case of corona, deaths are very few. Now, all these numbers, S, I, and R, they're expressed as fractions of the underlying population. So they're always between 0 and 1. And also, together they add up to 1, because everybody is unambiguously in one of these three buckets. So S plus I plus R is equal to 1. So the premise that Kermack and McKendrick made was, the only way the disease can spread is if an infected person meets a susceptible person, then with a certain probability, infection will take place. If two people in S meet, nothing happens. If two people in I meet, nothing happens, and so on and so forth. And there is a rate at which the infection spread, which they called beta, and you will be seeing the symbol again. And they also made this assumption, which is that people who recover are not liable for reinfection. That was the 1927 model. Over the next 40, 50 years, people realized that this is not a very good assumption. So they wanted to incorporate a situation where people who recover actually lose immunity over a period of time and get back to the susceptible group. So this is called the SIRS model. So which model should you use? Well, if you're talking about diseases like smallpox, measles, etc., where if you get it once, you don't get it again, then you should use the so-called SIR model. And if you have diseases like the flu, where immunity seems to last no more than 6 to 8 months, then you use the SIRS model. I won't go into a whole lot of detail. I just wanted to mention these initials because whenever people talk about modeling pandemic, they'll be using these acronyms. Now, a key parameter of this SIR model is known as R0, and this is called the basic reproduction ratio. And there is a mathematical definition, but the simple interpretation is, if there's one infected person, how many people does this infected person infect before he himself recovers? So it's kind of intuitively clear that if the basic reproduction ratio is less than 1, then the pandemic dies down. See, remember, the pandemic is seeded by a small number of initially infected people. And if the reproduction ratio is less than 1, that number just goes down to 0. On the other hand, if the reproduction ratio is greater than 1, then what happens is that initially the pandemic increases, more and more people get infected, more and more people recover, and eventually the infections begin to peak, and then the pandemic winds down. So the point at which the pandemic winds down is given by this formula, which is known as the herd immunity ratio. Now, the reason why I'm putting this formula is because there's a lot of nonsense talked about herd immunity. I'm sorry to use such strong language. Everybody talks about herd immunity ratio, and I have no clue what it is with very high probability. So what is the herd immunity ratio? It's R0 minus 1 divided by R0. So this is a number between 0 and 1. So the theory tells us that when the number of currently infected people plus the number of people who were infected in the past together adds up to this number H, then the number of infections peak and the pandemic wanes. So this means that the pandemic has no more people that it can infect, so it begins to decrease. So you can look at this formula. Suppose the basic reproduction ratio is 4, which means each person infects 4 others. So R0 minus 1 is 3 divided by 4. So this is 75%. So when 75% of the people are either infected or have recovered, meaning currently infected or previously infected, the pandemic begins to wind down. So the higher R0 is, the higher H is. So the more people have to be infected before the pandemic winds down. That's the logic. So now let's come to the Sutra model. One of the unique features of the coronavirus is what is known as the asymptomatic patients. So if you look at, say, a common cold, for example, if you're in a public place and the person next to you is coughing, you keep a distance because you know that this person is contagious. But in the case of corona, there are a large number of people who are asymptomatic. They do not manifest any symptoms. And most of the time, they themselves don't know that they're infected. But they can still infect others. Now, one of the questions you can ask is, are asymptomatic patients infecting others at the same rate as people with visible symptoms? So early in the pandemic last year already, in about March, April timeframe, in the year 2000, scientists did very carefully controlled experiments and they found that the asymptomatic patients infect others at nearly the same rate. That means the amount of viral load that they expel is just about the same as for the infected patients, visibly infected patients. And the duration of the shedding is also not much different. It's look like the asymptomatic people are shedding virus for about 8 days, and the people with visible symptoms do that for about 10 days. But the good news is, after that initial 8 to 10 day period, these asymptomatic patients, number one, are no longer capable of infecting anybody. Number two, they themselves are immune from getting any further infection for an undetermined period of time. So the main challenge in trying to predict the course of the pandemic is to estimate how many asymptomatic patients there are. So in the year 2013, there was a paper written. They call it the SAIR model. So we have already seen S for susceptible, I for infected, R for removed. So they introduced this new class called A for asymptomatic. And the premise in this model was that if S comes into contact with I, an infection will result. But if S comes into contact with A also, an infection can result, with possibly at a different rate. Whenever a person gets infected, initially they enter only the asymptomatic group. Then some fraction move to the infected group and others directly recover without ever going through this intermediate stage. And people in the infected group recover at a certain rate. So these set of bullet points can be illustrated by this picture. You have 4 boxes, S, A, I, and R. So whenever S and A come together, there is a fresh infection. Whenever I and A come together, there is also an infection. That is what these 2 arrowheads indicate. The infected people enter A. Some of them go to I. Some of them directly recover. And from the box I, some fraction recover. Now, the assumption in this model is that everybody in the group I can be measured because they display visible symptoms, and everybody in the group A escape observation because they are asymptomatic. So when we had to model the pandemic in India, we realized that some of these assumptions are false. First thing is, when people test positive, most of them are isolated in some form or the other, and they do not infect others to any substantial degree. So that means this link is not there because people in I are isolated from everybody else, from society at large. That was point number one. Point number two is, due to contact tracing, some fraction of A also get detected. So in other words, as soon as a person tests positive, there is contact tracing. They test the immediate positive family members. They test the neighbors, things like this. And if you go back to the first wave, you will see that for every person who tests positive, around 30 to 40 people are tested. Not that they're all positive, but the testing is quite widespread. That is called contact tracing. Therefore, this assumption that all patients in A escape observation is false. So we had to build that in. So what is the correct division? The correct division is not between asymptomatic patients and infected patients, but between those who test positive and those who are undetected. Now here I have to make an important distinction. A lot of the press and some so-called scientists are going to town talking about deliberate underreporting. And so people ask me, so how does your model cope with that? And our answer is very simple. Underreporting is a subset of you, undetected, and we don't care whether somebody is undetected because they themselves don't know they have the virus, or the authorities know but they have chosen not to report. It doesn't affect our predictions at all. Now, within the tested positive group, both in the first wave and the second wave, it has been the case that about 80% of those who test positive, in round numbers, are asymptomatic, and then they recover. Among those who test positive and are symptomatic, fatality ratios have been typically of the order of 10 to 12%. So that means if you are hospitalized, then your likelihood of passing away are about 12%. But since most people are asymptomatic, among the total cases, fatality ratios have been hovering around 1.2 to 1.5%. Everybody who's undetected recovers because really they're very mild. There is no reason for them to die. So here's the current version of the Sutra model. There is this big group called U for undetected. At some small rate, these undetected people move into this group, which is called the tested positive. The vast majority of them do not ever test positive, they directly recover. Among the tested positive group, most of them recover, but at a certain rate. And there's a different arrow you can put for deaths. We have chosen not to model deaths in the sutra because the deaths are subject to a whole bunch of external influences that we choose to, which are beyond our control. So notice that there is no box connecting T to S because of the premise that the kind of people who test positive are isolated. If you are interested, here are the equations. They're pretty straightforward equations. There are only 4 numbers. One is called beta. This is the contact rate. So when a susceptible person meets an undetected person, what is the likelihood of a fresh infection? The other one is called gamma. Gamma is the rate at which people recover. And this, by the way, does not change very much. Typically, gamma is about 0.1, which means that the average person recovers in about 10 days. Now, this doesn't mean that like clockwork, everybody recovers on the 10th day. It means that is the average duration of stay. These are the 2 innovative parameters of the Sutra model. One is called epsilon. This is called the undetection rate. So the total number of cases, U plus T, equals 1 over epsilon times T. So epsilon tells you the extent to which people are out there who are not detected. And the fourth one is called reach. It is an implicit parameter. It is not there in these equations, but I'll tell you what the reach has to do with anything a few slides later. In fact, sorry, here's the slide. So what is the main challenge in trying to fit available data to this model? Now remember all these things, S, U, T, they're all fractions, okay? They're all numbers that add up to 1, but you don't get fractions. What you get are actual cases. So you see in Telangana yesterday, 2,000 some odd cases, Karnataka, 10,000 cases, etc., etc. So you have to convert the raw cases to fractions because the available data are case counts, which are integers. So how do you get the fraction of the population? You have to divide the case counts by the underlying population. Well, so what is the underlying population? Now you may say you're stupid, that everybody knows the answer is 140 crores. No, that's not true. Because suppose for the sake of argument, when the pandemic first started, and you had, let's say, 20 cases, do you divide by 140 crores? No. you only divide by the population that was potentially exposed to the disease. And that is where the concept of reach comes in. It's the fraction of the population that could have caught the disease. It starts at 0 at the start of the pandemic and increases towards 1. So just to remind you once again, 1 over epsilon gives you the ratio between the total cases to the tested positive cases. So if you subtract 1, you get the ratio between the undetected cases to the tested cases. So both the reach parameter rho and epsilon are new concepts. No other existing mathematical model has them. The so-called previous supermodel had epsilon but not rho. And once we realized that the reach is a growing parameter, we could actually do a very good job of fitting the data. Now, one of the somewhat shocking discoveries we made was that a lot of the published literature does not actually fit data to the model. They just postulate some numbers based on some other studies, whereas we made this the cornerstone of our approach. We have to have robust methods for parameter estimation from the given data. And after some amount of mathematical manipulations, which you can look up in our paper if you're really interested, we found that there are two quantities which are purely measurable, and there is a linear relationship between these two measured quantities, and that allows us to estimate the parameters of the model. There's a small initial mismatch period, but after that, this linear relationship holds. And now remember, data is constantly coming in. So when new data fails to satisfy the linear relationship, we recalibrate, and this is what is called a phase change. So I have chosen just one picture, and you can see from the caption, this is called phase 5 of Italy pandemic. And what we are plotting, if you have very good eyes, you can see, it's basically the time minus the one constant times the total tested positive plus total recovered, that is on the vertical axis. And here is the product of the tested positive times tested positive plus recovered. So don't ask me why. This is where the clever mathematics comes in. But what I want you to appreciate is, once you plot these numbers on a linear scale, on a straight line going to the origin, you see they fit quite well. In fact, the so-called R squared, which is called goodness of fit criterion, it's very, very good. Now, as more and more data comes up, they may not land on a straight line anymore. That's when we do the so-called phase change. Now you may say, how many phases are there? Well, for every country, there are multiple phases, maybe 6, 7, 8 phases. And we have done about 20 countries. We have done all the 29 states of 30 states of India. And we have done many, many districts of these large states. So we have got literally hundreds of phases. So clearly the process has to be automated. And that's something we have managed to do. So what is a phase change? So this is another important contribution of the Sutra model. You see, the parameters of a model don't stay static. They change with time. Either they change gradually or they change abruptly. So beta, which is the contact parameter, if I can just remind you what it was, is this thing right there. When a susceptible person meets an undetected person, what is the likelihood of a fresh infection? That's this contact rate beta. So what can cause beta to change? Well, first and most dominant factor is people get overconfident. This happened obviously after the first wave, and they start disregarding COVID protocols. Second, when you get a new mutant virus like B1.617, which was sometimes called the Indian variant. Now, if I can just digress a little bit, the World Health Organization has said that they don't want Indian variant, they want to call it Delta. I was just looking at a Greek website and they said, well, if you're offended by Indian variant, then we are offended by Delta, because that has nothing to do with Greece either. So we can just use the correct notation, which is B1617. Anyway, bottom line is, new variants, what do? They are more infectious. So when two people come together, the likelihood of an infection becomes higher. And this process of increase becomes gradual because remember, when there's a new mutation, the pre-mutation virus and the post-mutation virus, they coexist. But because the mutant virus has a survival advantage, over a period of time, the mutation overwhelms its predecessor. So these are situations where beta increases slowly. Now, when you have a non-pharmaceutical intervention, a policy change, like a lockdown, then beta will decrease very suddenly. For example, when we announced the lockdown in March of 2020, beta decreased by a factor of half what it was earlier. Now let's talk about the reach factor. When the pandemic starts, it's usually highly localized. So for example, we know that the first wave of the pandemic started in Kerala from Gulf returnees. We know that the second wave of the pandemic started in the Amravati district of Maharashtra. So those are confined to those geographic regions, and then slowly they spread. So there can be both global factors and local factors. The global factor is obvious. As I said, the pandemic starts in one part of the country and spreads. The local factor is more interesting. And this is something we have discovered again while doing the modeling. Suppose you take a city like Hyderabad, for example. If you do a kind of a serological survey to find out what fraction of the people have antibodies, you'll find that it's not constant at all. It depends quite a bit on the locality. In places where people are living side by side, this ratio will be very high. And then there are protected bubbles like gated communities where this number is very low. But then the gated communities cannot protect themselves forever. And eventually the virus penetrates there also, and then they fall within the range of the virus. So whether it is at the national level or at a state level or a city level, the reach starts at 0 and increases to 1. And there is no reason why the reach has to be constant across the nation, across the state, or even across the city. It depends on the fine-grainedness to which you want to do the modeling. Okay, so enough of the background. Now comes the actual substance, which is the predictions. So let's start with predictions for other countries. We made predictions for 20 countries, approximately. USA, UK, Italy, Japan, Spain, Korea, you name it. We did them all. But the most interesting ones are Italy, Spain, Japan, USA, and UK, because they've all had multiple waves. But unlike our case, where the spacing between waves was about 8 months, in these cases, USA and UK, the space was just a few months. So we could explain why these waves occurred by looking at the reach of the pandemic. And I'm going to show you now the next 2 slides, the actual and model fitted daily case totals. But this is the 7-day moving average of the daily cases, because the actual daily cases, pardon me, is very jerky. Now this is for the USA. So they had the first wave in April, second wave in July, if you can see that. And if you ignore those little bumps, they had their third massive wave towards the end of 2020. And it has been quite downhill ever since. We haven't updated this picture, but it's pretty much been falling. And we used a total of 10 different phases. And you can see the way the phases. So there's one phase change, another phase change, like that. Now I want to show you UK because it's very interesting. So we used the 7 phases for UK. They had, again, the first peak, then the second peak. Now this third peak again came in January of this year. They had over 60,000 cases a day. The population of UK is 5% of the population of India. So this is like 1.2 million cases per day in India. Now I should tell you that we caught a peak right there. About a week to 10 days before the peak occurred, our team made a prediction on Twitter that cases are going to peak in about a week or 10 days, and sure enough, it happened. Now, why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this because of this piece here. See, the cases in UK went down to 2,000. Now they're going back up to 7,000. Yesterday, yesterday it was 7,000. So everybody is very concerned. Are we going to see one more peak like that one? And our prediction is no, you are going to see a peak towards the middle of July, but it's going to be nothing like that one. Okay. So USA and UK, well, we don't care about USA and UK maybe. So let's talk about India. So we made the call for India that will hit a peak around the middle of September. And we made this prediction, we hit the peak around the end of September. We made this call in the middle of September, but believe it or not, at that point, we were still a government committee. So we did not get permission to go public with our finding till October 18th, which was about there. And so in some sense, some of our glory was lost because by October 18th, every Tom, Dick and Harry knew that the cases had peaked. So the reaction was, yeah, we can see that for ourselves. So if we had actually been allowed to make our predictions there, people would have seen that we were actually ahead of the game. And this is our predictions. Okay. Going to about the end of April. This is the so-called first wave. And you don't need me to tell you that this did not happen. So around here, things started picking up again. So what caused the second wave? So I'll show you some data. So this is right from March 2020, the very, very start of the pandemic. We have 9 different phases. Start dates for each of these phases. And this is the initial drift period. And I'm showing you the beta contact parameter and the epsilon, which is the underestimation parameter, and the reach, which is shown as a percentage. That is why the 100 is there. I just want to give you one small heads up. The so-called reproduction ratio, basic reproduction ratio, is just 10 times beta. So when the pandemic started, we had a basic reproduction ratio of 3.2. So obviously, pandemic grew very fast. Right around here, the first lockdowns were imposed, and this brought it down to 2.6, and then down to 1.6, and we stayed in 1.6 for a good long time. Then, thanks to the festival season and so on, it started increasing. And now in February, it just exploded from 2.3 to 3.8. Then various lockdown measures brought it down again to 2.8. But that's not the whole story. Look at the reach parameter. Initially, the reach was close to 0. Well, that's not surprising because the pandemic was highly localized. Even early in this year, only 33.7% of the population was within reach of the pandemic. There was a major breakout and another major breakout. So we had like a double whammy. One whammy was the contact rate increasing, which meant the reproduction ratio going up, as you can see, by approximately 60%. So this was spreading very fast. Secondly, the increase in the reach meant that there were a lot more people that were susceptible for the infection. Okay? So those are the twin factors. So just to recapitulate what I said, the basic reproduction ratio went from 2.3 to 3.8. And there was this new variant which started in Amravati and Maharashtra, and also people disregarding COVID guidelines. Okay, can we disentangle these two factors and say how much is due to which factor? Well, there are laboratory experiments that show that this B1.617 is about 30% more infectious. That means it should cause beta to increase by between 20 to 30%, but I chose the higher number. But see, what is R0? It increased from 2.3 to 3.8. That's an increase of 60%. So the mutation alone does not explain the 60%. Where is the other 60% coming from? Believe it or not, it is coming from that. People completely disregarding COVID guidelines, and that caused the disease to spread really, really fast. And also the fact that more and more people came within the reach of the pandemic reinforced the spread. So the last point, of course, is that when the lockdown was imposed, it brought the basic reproduction ratio from 3.8 down to 2.8. But lockdowns are not a sustainable long-term solution. So we made some presentations recently showing that lockdowns can be eased in states where the reach is over 75% and some other criteria hold, and there will be only a marginal impact on cases in the short term, like the next 2 to 3 months. Okay, let me show you the actual curve then. So we made a prediction on the 29th of April. That is this light golden curve. We said that cases are going to peak on the 5th of May, right there. That was a very bold prediction because all hell was breaking loose. Nobody believed that the peak was anywhere close by. And unlike last time, we did not have the government guidelines to prevent us from going public without prediction. So as it turned out, this pale gold curve is what we predicted on April 29. And the blue is the actual course, and it peaked about 3 days later. And the level was not much different, about 3.9 lakhs, 7-day moving average. So then later on, we recomputed the model on the 15th of May, which is the dark gold curve, that one there. And you can see it's still good. So the point is that we have not recomputed this since nearly a month now, and it continues to track. Okay. Now you notice this curve ends roughly at the end of June. You can go to this website called sutra-india.in, and you can see predictions not just for India, but for all the states and many, many districts, though not every single district. Okay, so this is where we are now. So what does the future hold? So everybody now kind of concedes that we managed to get the second wave right. So people want to know, can you forecast a third wave? Well, so what do we need to do in order to forecast a third wave? So we need to analyze where we are today and understand how we got here. Remember this number 1 over epsilon, which is the undercounting parameter. And I just will show you this picture. So the undercounting parameter has barely changed. It has been at 28 right from the beginning. So that means that the total number of cases is 28 times those who test positive, or put it slightly differently, for every tested positive case, there are 27 undetected cases. And again, I want to emphasize, these 27 undetected cases is not somebody hiding them. It's the case of people who mostly simply did not even know that they were infected. Okay, so what does this tell us in terms of actual numbers? So you look at the total number of infections in the pandemic on May 8th, which was the day on which the second wave peaked. And if you use the basic reproduction ratio of 2.8, which you remember from the table, the herd immunity ratio, R0 minus 1 over R0, 1.8 over 2.8 is about close to 2/3. Therefore, if the total number of cases was 61.6 crores, and this represents 65% of the population, so the susceptible population, you just simply divide 61.6 by 0.65, you get approximately 95 crores. So this is the number of people who are susceptible on that day. Okay, what does this tell us? Well, this is roughly the adult population of India. But if you remember, the reach at that point was only 72.3%. So there are a couple of ways of interpreting this number, and we do not know which is correct. We do not know. I'll be very honest with you. One way of interpreting the 72.3% is most adults are in the reach and most children are not. Another way of interpreting this is 72.3% of everybody, which is approximately 95 divided by the population of India, 140 crore. This many percentage of everybody, including adults and children alike, are in the reach of the pandemic, and the children are next. So the only way to interpret this correctly is to do widespread serological surveys, including children. The previous serological survey was done in January. To be very honest, a sero survey done in January has no relevance today. We need to do fresh sero surveys. We have been pleading with various agencies to get fresh sero surveys done, and we will see why in just a minute. Okay, so what could trigger a third wave? We need to understand. So as of today, so 2.2 was the number of cases at the peak. So herd immunity is the ratio at the peak. Okay, so that's what this calculation is. So this 0.65, you should not multiply today's number, but the number on May 8. But if you look today, total number of infections is 2.77. And if you use this multiplier, you get about 78.4 crore Indians have recovered. The interesting point is that studies both in India and in other countries have shown that reinfections have been very, very close to zero. In other words, are there 78.4 crore distinct people, or is it some people getting sick again and again? And this particular studies in the literature, both Indian and abroad, suggest that most people are not getting reinfected. Therefore, these are actually 78 crore distinct individuals. Well, that's good news because all these people have immunity in the short run. But then the question is, how long do they retain their immunity? Is it a year or 2, 5 years? Nobody knows. And what happens when we start vaccinating people? Do they induce immunity in those who don't have them now? Do they prolong immunity in those who already have now? And then the question that was asked when I was introduced, will the next wave target minors? So these are all the questions that we need to be looking at. So how do we forecast a third wave? So right now, our model is, I would call it a medium-term model. If you saw all the graphs that I have shown, it's good for about 3 to 4 months. That's why I call it a medium-term model. As distinct from short-term models, which are only good for 2 weeks. I make it a point to say that because a lot of people who talk so much on TV and so on, they are just doing time series projections for 2 to 3 weeks, and it has no relevance for policy decision making. Ours is a medium-term model. In order to make it truly a long-term model, we have to take care of a couple of features that are missing now. One is, how does acquired immunity erode over the people who have recovered? And second, what is the impact of vaccination? So all we have to do is to modify the block diagram to include the erosion of immunity. And this is captured by something that is called the kernel. I'll come back to this part of the text in a minute after I show you the picture. So this piece here is just the previous Sutra model. And on top of the Sutra model, we have added 2 arrows. One is that some of the people who have recovered from the tested positive group become susceptible again. And the other arrow is that some of the people who didn't even know they were infected are also going to become susceptible again. And the rate at which these people lose immunity, there is no reason to believe that it differs from the rate at which these people lose their immunity. Now, what is this delta? This gives you the rate at which people are losing immunity. The old classical model called SIRS, which I mentioned briefly, it assumes that the erosion is exponential, which means the day a person recovers, he already starts losing immunity. And the maximum loss is in the beginning and the loss tapers off with time. Both of these are completely unrealistic from an epidemiologist standpoint. So why do people do that? Well, because they can analyze the equation. That's not a good reason. Instead, what we propose, based on reading the literature, are 2 different erosion models. Each of them has got a start time and an end time. Typically, the start time is about 3 months, as I said, and the end time is about 8 months or maybe even longer. The 2 possible ways are that in this interval between the start time and the end time you lose at a fixed rate, which we call uniform erosion. Or the other is that initially it is slow erosion, then it peaks and then goes down again. What we are hoping for again is serological surveys, but these are what are called longitudinal surveys. So in other words, if you want to know what fraction of the population is in possession of antibodies today, you just pick people at random and test them. But if you want to know which of these curves is correct, what you have to do is to take a cohort of people and test them again and again and again. In other words, the same people have to be followed over a period of about 6 to 8 months. Now, the good news is that to do a nationwide sero survey, you need a large number of samples, maybe 50,000, 1 lakh samples. But to infer this, you can manage with about something of the order of 4,000 to 5,000 samples. So we are trying to generate these kinds of studies. And let me assure you, if we actually can generate this kind of a data on the rate at which people lose their immunity, we will be amongst the first groups in the world to have these kinds of studies. Okay, now what about vaccination? Now, everyone has heard this phrase, efficacy of a vaccine. What does it mean? Vaccination reduces the susceptible population by a fixed percentage. And that varies from one vaccine to another, not by very much, but by a little bit. Now, here is another important point. Suppose you read that a vaccine has 80% efficacy. What does that mean? It means if you take 100 people, 80 of them will get very, very good reaction, and the remaining 20 don't get much of a reaction. And the problem basically is that you don't always have a good way of predicting which these 20 people are. So the classical vaccination modeling is that if you vaccinate enough people, you don't actually prevent. So there are two things that happen. These people who actually produce antibodies, they generally do not catch the disease. Almost never do they catch a severe version of the disease, and almost never do they die. But they can still continue to infect others. But the theory is that if you vaccinate enough people, you can prevent the disease from spreading. That's the idea. By making the R sub 0 smaller than 1, so that any local outbreaks die down. Now, the problem is the efficacy of a vaccine also erodes over time. How quickly? No information as of now. And the only way to test that is to follow people and watch them. Now, the good news is that I showed you this picture, which showed how to model erosion of immunity by just making a couple of tweaks on the Sutra model. And the good news is the impact of vaccination can also be incorporated into the Sutra model with a couple of minor tweaks. I won't show them to you now because the picture will become very crowded, but please believe me that it's not a major change. The basic Sutra model is still good for both erosion of immunity and impact of vaccination. So this is my last slide. So what about the action wave for action items for predicting the third wave? So from the published literature, we'll come up with the best guess estimate for the immunity erosion, and we keep updating as we get more information. The real problem for us is that there is no anticipated rollout rate of vaccination. In other words, there is no government website that says, this is how many vaccinations we plan to do. Only thing we can get is from something like CoWIN portal, which gives you retrospective information, how many vaccines were administered until then. So we just look at the orders, and we're going to look at these numbers as a possible rollout schedule. 8 crores in June, 10 crores in July, and 12 crores thereafter, because we need to make a prediction now. So if we keep on waiting for the data to come, we'll have only a short-term model which isn't any good. So what we're going to do is to use this as a starting point, and as the actual data and information becomes available, we'll be tweaking our predictions. But here is one last estimate that I'll leave you with, which is that based on all the numbers that I have shown you, based on the herd immunity level, if we can vaccinate about 55 to 60% of the population by the end of 2021, the third wave, if any, would be what I would like to call a third bump. Okay, what are the things that can make this go wrong? Two things. Number one, people start declaring victory too early and again repeat the mistake of taking off the mask, not complying with COVID guidelines. That is entirely in our hands. We should not make that mistake. The other thing which is not in our hands is the possible emergence of yet another still more virulent virus. But the point is that people are going to be watching for it. And as soon as something begins to show up, we'll be ready. It is a fact that in the previous second wave, even though there was ample evidence that this new variant was spreading in Maharashtra, not enough actions were taken. So that's all I have to say. I will stop this thing here. And if there are any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them.
Thank you, Vidyasagar Garu. That was a very fascinating insight into what happens and what could potentially happen. So you currently, government is not in any way consulting you. You're not consulting with the government. Is that?
No, that is not quite true. Okay, let's put it this way. So after November, we actually did not meet anybody for a while. Then we made a very informal presentation in April. It was not a formal presentation. But now, because of our success in tracking the course of the pandemic, because we, as I said, we had the courage to call the peak. Because of our courage in calling the peak, when everyone was, projecting doom and gloom, and it actually came to pass, in the last month, towards the end of May, we were actually once again called by the so-called empowered group, which is supposed to make recommendations about the coronavirus, and especially about lifting off the lockdowns. And that's where we showed that you can actually ease the lockdowns. It won't cause any major breakouts again. So that was the only formal consultation we had after November of last year. So.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, because this issue has been, in terms of the lack of compassion or an apathetic attitude towards all the governments across the country. What really was the super spreader? Was it the farmers' protest? Was it the Kumbh? Was it the elections? How do you have any sense of where this happened?
Well, I mean, if you look at the data, it's crystal clear that the pandemic started in Maharashtra. I mean, you just go by the statewide daily case numbers. Already by the middle of February, cases were rising in Maharashtra. And by first week of March, they were completely out of bounds. On March 8th, 9th, 10th, that kind of a time frame. And I'm choosing those days because Kumbh Mela started on the 11th of March. But if you look at March 8th, 9th, 10th, that kind of time frame, Maharashtra accounted for 2/3 of the cases in India. 2/3. I mean, it's just a completely staggering statistic that nobody wants to pay attention to. So most certainly Kumbh Mela did not trigger it. Okay. Now, could it have made it worse? I do not know. I mean, people say that participants had to give an RT-PCR test and all that, and I don't want to get into that because people have politicized it way too much. Same with the election rallies as well. But the worst hit states in the second wave were Kerala, Karnataka, Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra, none of which had elections. Okay. So it again becomes kind of like a convenient bogey. The farmers' protest is an interesting one because it is like a lead indicator. What is upsetting to me at as a normal citizen, not speaking as a scientist now, but as a normal person, every week under 1,000 people are coming. They come and sit there for a week or two, take part in the protest and go back. Obviously, it's a super spreader. I mean, people say protesting is a fundamental right. I have no quarrel with that. But flouting COVID guidelines is not a fundamental right. I mean, all of us who are living in Hyderabad, we remember what happened in April and May. When we went grocery shopping, all the shops had the circles on the pavement 6 feet apart, and you stood there. We had no problem with that. So why weren't these guys told, okay, stay in these circles, you protest to your heart's content, we're not bothered. So, and wear masks and all that. So that the fact that the farmers' protest is still going on, I think is unpardonable. Whether it was a super spreader, there is no clear indication of that. Is it a spreader now? Oh, yeah, most definitely. Because if you look at Punjab, Punjab's case fatality ratio is twice the national average. The rest of the country has a case fatality ratio of 1.2%. Punjab is at 2.5%. And this is not yesterday or today. This has been steady for 2 whole months. And why is that? Obvious to anybody who's unbiased. You have a whole bunch of people coming and sort of reigniting the pandemic, right? If they didn't have, then like in every other state, there would be a peak and it will be going down. But it's not happening in Punjab. So, highly politically incorrect answer. But I mean, I thought this audience at least might want to hear what I actually feel.
No, thank you for that. The other thing I wanted to ask you, I remember you were mentioning about the kind of lockdowns that are, you were mentioning that the UP lockdown of is a better than a compressed 6 to 9 kind of a lockdown.
Yes.
So that share something on data. And...
Sure. So that's a very interesting. We have paper in the progress, but here's the idea. You see, in the first wave, if you remember, the Prime Minister used to call meetings by video conference, all the chief minister, at least some of them who didn't have massive egos, they were all attending these meetings. And then some centralized policies were made. You know, the government, central government said, you divide the country into green zones, orange zones, red zones. In the green zone, you do this, orange zone, you do this, red zone, you do this. Implementation is left to individual states. This time, for whatever reason, central government completely did not do anything. Everything was left to the individual states. With the end result that we had a fascinating situation where we had one country with multiple lockdowns. So we could actually compare and contrast the efficacy of different lockdown models in the country. Now, in the literature, these kind of comparisons have been made. But the weakness of those comparisons is that they were not a like to like. Somebody will say, oh, this is the lockdown model in Spain. This is the lockdown model in Argentina. How can you compare them? I mean, there are so many similarities that you cannot compare them. But in India, you can certainly compare UP versus Bihar, Karnataka versus Maharashtra, all these things you can do. And we decided to use a very simple criterion. The simplest criterion is, what was the basic reproduction ratio before lockdown? What was the basic reproduction ratio after lockdown? And how much percentage was the decrease? That's it. Because if you start trying to make it too cute or too fancy, you get sidetracked into all kinds of issues. So we found that the biggest percentage reduction in the basic reproduction ratio was achieved in Uttar Pradesh, which basically never implemented the kind of full lockdown that was there in Maharashtra or Delhi, or even what we had in Hyderabad, Telangana for about 2-3 weeks. They basically said shops remain open, but crowded events are banned, no weddings. And if the police see some gatherings taking place, marches and all that, they try to break them up. Whereas in Delhi, Maharashtra, and for a few weeks here in Hyderabad, even already in Chennai now, Tamil Nadu, I should say, all life was compressed into just a few hours, which actually had the reverse effect of what you were trying to do. You want to spread out the contact between people over a period of time. Certainly, what you don't want is everybody in Chennai or Hyderabad or Pune trying to squeeze all activity into a 2 or 3 hour period. Now, going from what I'll call this kind of a intuitive explanation to a quantifiable explanation, I think that is our contribution. So because you can actually use the data to say, as I mentioned just now, this was R0 before lockdown, this is R0 after lockdown. And some of the states had multiple lockdowns. Delhi had a very strict lockdown and then a little less strict lockdown. Now, of course, they're in the process of relaxing. So you can talk about, the stage versus, one shot, very total lockdown. Anyway, we'll see what the journals make of this paper, because you see, unlike the Sutra model, which is mathematics and nobody can argue, the minute you start saying that UP reduced R0 better than Maharashtra, for example, everybody will jump on it and say, you're politicizing it. Well, we're not politicizing it. We don't care about that. I mean, numbers don't lie. I mean, if you think that UP hasn't done a good job, please feel free. But, show it to us on the basis of publicly available data, not on the basis of your preconceptions.
Thank you. There's another question that I have is, in your model, when you're talking about the effect of the vaccination, that variable on vaccination also you're going to incorporate for the prediction of the third wave. Would that vaccination, because we are primarily having 2 vaccinations in India, primarily, and each one of them has again a different efficacy and a different, so would you have a multivariable or a 2-variable thing also in your model?
That's a really, really good question. Let me just answer a question from Professor M.R. Rao, if I may. He says, given that the parameters of the model are tweaked often, what is the accuracy of your model if predictions are made 1 week in advance, 2 weeks in advance, month in advance? Sir, I want to tell you, from March 2020 till June 2021, which is 15 months, we have tweaked the parameters 9 times. That's 1.5 months on average. Okay. So over a 1 week or 2 week period, our model is going to be extremely good. Now, a month in advance, remember that picture I showed you with the straight line? That's our guideline. So long as your data matches the straight line, you don't need to tweak parameters. But the flip side of it was, when the second wave hit, we literally had to tweak the parameters about every week or so. I don't want to bring that presentation again for just one slide, but the last phase had a drift period of 40 days. For 40 days, the parameters were running all over the place, and finally they became stable, and that's when we felt very confident about our prediction. So today, if you were to ask me on June 11th, what will be the number of cases on June 30th, which is 3 weeks ahead, we'll be very confident about that. Middle of July, reasonably confident. If you say middle of November, no, forget it. We have to put all these factors in. Now, coming back to Hari's question, the real question is not Covishield versus Covaxin. The real question is 1 dose versus 2 doses. That's the way we have to divide the population. And remember, the way the vaccines are designed, there is essentially no 1 dose Covaxin person. I mean, there may be because they couldn't get the second dose. That's a different matter. But Covaxin is designed for boom, boom, 4 to 6 weeks. That's it. Whereas Covishield, they have been extending the gap. Initially, they said 4 weeks. Now they're saying 84 days. 84 days is 12 weeks. Okay. because they believe that it does not reduce the efficacy. So we're still looking into that. In other words, is it a I mean, the efficacy differences between the two vaccines are not so big that we need to segregate the population into Covishield group versus Covaxin. But it looks like we should really segregate the 1-dose people from the 2-dose people. And there is a modeling question. That is, how much trouble is it worth to you to try to do this fine-grained modeling? You know, suppose you want to say what fraction of people in Telangana are 1 dose versus 2 doses versus, let's say, Maharashtra versus Tamil Nadu. It's a lot of work to extract all this information. And it might be that it doesn't really make any difference. You know, because the point is, even for the people who have completed 2 doses, 80% of them only are going to get protection. Which are those 80%? We don't care, because we're only trying to predict at a very gross global level. So maybe we should just ignore the 1 dose versus 2 dose. Now, so the answer to your question is, we will start off by segregating 1 dose versus 2 dose people. But I don't rule out the possibility that we'll discover that it doesn't really make any difference. That you might as well just ignore the difference. But we'll know that really in about 6 to 8 weeks time, not right now.
And do you have, you were saying the sero survey done in January is not of much value now, but just in terms of how long the antibodies last from the last wave to now, do we have any data as such?
No, no, that's the reason why I'm saying it has no value. If they had kept those people together,
okay,
and went back to the same people, so that is what is called a longitudinal study, right? But sampling one bunch of people in January, another bunch of people in June, that tells you nothing.
Okay. Do you think we are capable of doing that? Doing the same set of people? Are we capable as a country?
Oh, absolutely. We're certainly capable of it. As I said, you don't need a whole lot of people.
No, but so is it because is it done at the state level or is it done at the national level?
So here's what we've been trying. We've been talking to 2 very large companies that have nationwide presence and that also have a very diversified workforce. What I mean by diversified workforce is they're not IT companies.
Okay.
So in an IT company, everybody is going to be young. Everybody is going to be relatively well paid. So, I mean, studies in that group are definitely not representative. The kind of companies we're talking up to are companies that have white collar, blue collar, contract laborers, the whole shebang. And they also have operations all over the country. Okay. So it's like a mini India, basically. That's what we're looking for. And one company had actually done a mini survey. But key point is with the same group of people months apart. And we told them, well, it's nice you have done this, but your sample size is too small. You should have used about 5-6 times the number of samples. They said, no problem, we'll do it. So it would have been great if they had thought to do it earlier, but anyway, they're going to do it now. That's the first company. You'll forgive me for not mentioning the name of the company. The second company, we're still in the process of trying to persuade them, but we can easily do that, okay? So I guess our biggest problem has been persuading the appropriate government authorities of the need to do this kind of a survey. We have been hammering on that. And rather ironically, we have had more success with the private sector than with the public sector. Now, somebody is asking, what about data integrity? Well, you know, the point is, we have to work with the data we have, all right? Let me just look at this question. Data integrity on infections and deaths. Okay, deaths, we're not even touching that, because, you know, the point is that in some states you had legislators black marketing oxygen supplies and all that stuff. So, I mean, deaths are a completely different ball game. Okay, so we don't even touch deaths. You notice I didn't have a box called deaths. Okay. Infections, And if you recall the part of my presentation where I said, under-reporting is the same as a part of rather undetected. So it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference to us. If one state does a better job of reporting, then the epsilon factor will come down. If another state does a bad job of reporting, and not necessarily intentionally, by the way. I mean, obviously, all things being equal, I'm just saying this as an example. A place like Himachal Pradesh is going to have far more undetected cases just because it's an inaccessible place. I mean, we're not criticizing the government, it's just the geography, right? But we can actually compensate for that in our model. Let me just see there.
Hari, can I ask
Do we have
question?
data on the number? We have number of tests on RT-PCR and antigen tests. The answer to that question is ICMR has them, but it won't let us have them. So that's the answer. So if you can just persuade ICMR to share the data, we will be very grateful. What is the ideal time gap between first and second dose? So this 28 to 84 to 90 days is only for Covishield, not for Covaxin. Covaxin has been very steady 4 to 6 weeks. Now, because of supply bottlenecks, it may stretch beyond 6 weeks, but their guideline has not changed. Whereas in the case of Covishield, they have themselves been changing the guidelines. So is this VAN my good friend Anant Nageshwaran? Sounds
yes.
like it. Okay. Okay. All right. Why do you say, ironically, I'm trying to do my imitation of Anant here. Why do you say, ironically, we have had more success? Why do you say, ironically, we had more success with the private sector than with the public sector? Well, I found it ironic, because the government has nearly infinite resources, And I thought it would be a no-brainer to tell them, look, you tested a bunch of people back then, keep track of them and test the same bunch of people. And then if we really had data and say 20, 30, 40,000 people at different points in time, this would be the biggest longitudinal study in the world. We'd have been world pioneers, but we have not been able to do that. And somehow the private sector has been a little bit more receptive. I can't explain it more than that. Just simply reporting my experience, that's all.
So to
Hari,
Yeah,
if you're
Kali,
permission, can I ask questions?
yeah, please, Kali, go ahead.
Yeah, sir.
People.
Yeah, I know. Wonderful presentation. Though we didn't understand maths formulas much, but your explanation at least gives us a clarity that at least that model is very robust and it's quite practical. These predictions. I have two questions, sir. One is that in simple terms, when is this wave is going to end? I could see this curve by end of June. This wave will be more or less, ending. And what is the time period before which the third wave can probably hit? And what is the? After you said it will not be as serious as the maybe second wave, but when is it going to hit? That is one question, sir. And second question is, I keep looking at the data every day about this number of reported cases of the COVID-19 the database. I observed all the coastal states from Maharashtra, Karnataka, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, West Bengal. They have relatively far higher cases than the states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, even of course one exception is Gujarat. They have only currently last at least weekend days only less than 1 or 2,000 cases per day kind of a thing.
Right.
But these coastal states have large number. What is the reason for just?
So I think that could be just coincidence. I mean, there is no particular reason why coastal states should have either an advantage or a disadvantage. I mean, if you try to say, does hot, humid weather help the virus or not help the virus? so far there seems to be no such, for example, if you look at the US, you can take, say, Florida, for example. They've actually done reasonably well. And a state like New York, which is also coastal but very cold, they've done far worse. Then the other factor, your first question. So according to our portal, maybe if I can just show the portal, I think that may be the best thing. I hope you can all see this portal. So this is the Sutra India.in portal. And you see, if you look at 30th of June, I'm sorry, the fonts are a bit small, but our prediction is 26,870 cases. So if you look at the shape of the curve, by the end of June, you can say that this wave is kind of over. So let me stop sharing. Now, when will the third wave hit? Well, if you look at the published literature, essentially there is nobody reporting that antibodies last less than 3 months. So we're sort of safe for about 3 months from the end of June. So that means July, August, September. So we need to.
Can I just interrupt you here? Okay. Is it possible for us to take the data, the sero surveys done in UK or the US, where they could have done it on the same people and seen how long the antibodies last? Take that data and model it for India. Is that possible?
So ironically, no US studies, no UK studies. The two best studies have been done in Denmark and Italy.
Okay. And
so we're going to use that. Yeah, they've been doing for the same group of people. The most impressive one is that. So the Denmark study is the most interesting one. What it suggests is that even after 8 months, 80% of the people still had antibodies. Whereas the Italian study says that at the end of 8 months, most people had lost their antibodies. So we have to figure out, reconcile the two, or maybe it's not reconcilable. I mean, there are obviously going to be genetic differences. So what we decided to do, because, the point of third wave prediction is, I would say, and you can please tell me if you agree or disagree. I think a large part of the third wave prediction is to be pessimistic, because we want to help people prepare. So if you make a pessimistic prediction and it doesn't happen, people will be actually relieved, I would say. So we're going to lean towards the Italian prediction, which shows for the first 3 months, everybody has the antibodies intact. And in some curved fashion, at the end of 8 months, everybody loses them. So we will use that kind of a model for the erosion of immunities. And then we'll see where we go from there. Let's see. Are there any questions on the chat?
Yes, I think.
Okay, why best managed countries, including Taiwan, Singapore, etc., are now partial lockdown? This is a very good question, because the reason is, and Japan also, by the way, these countries, they had very, very low reach. In other words, because they were so effective in lockdown, by the time the curve went down, yeah, the first wave was over, but what was the reach? In some of these countries, like Taiwan specifically, the reach was 3%. That means 97% of the country was still out there. Now, in the case of Taiwan, it was a geographical separation because the pandemic was confined to the big cities. But, sooner or later, it will leak out. Same thing with UK. When they had the deadly wave in December, January, their reach was only at around 40%. And then it went from 40% to about 70% in a matter of just weeks. Because they also had the same problem. It went beyond the metros to the countryside. Okay. Now, in the case of India, I don't believe that's what happened. There are some of it, of course, the countryside getting affected. But we believe, and there's no way to verify this, so this is a guess, so please take it like that. It's much more within the city, the protected bubbles like the gated communities and all getting penetrated. That is why if you notice the profile of the patients in the second round, much more affluent compared to the patients in the first round and much younger. Okay. So, but anyway, the answer to your question is that, yeah, the states like Taiwan, Singapore, which are very well managed, there's no question. They're in partial lockdown because the pandemic has broken out of the original confinement. So I think that if they use this model, we hope that they will be able to anticipate and take corrective measures. Okay, next question. Would modeling based on state-wise population stratification by age make a difference to the prediction? See, there are, in modeling, the simple principle is the fewer the parameters you estimate, the better the prediction is going to be. So for every locality, whether it is a country, state, or district, we have just 4 parameters. Of course, they change with time. That's a separate matter. Now, I have seen models with 56 parameters. And I mean, let's face it, you're never going to get any accuracy with 56 parameters. That's just guesswork, okay? So we kind of decided to avoid stratifying by age. But some of these models, which are too elaborate in my mind, they take into account the fact that interaction patterns between age groups are different. But in India, we have much more 3-generation families. We should understand that 3-generation families are much more an Indian feature than in other countries. Children pick it up from school, they give it to parents, who then give it to grandparents. This doesn't happen in other countries so much. So that's why we kind of decided to avoid the age-wise stratification. So it may make a difference, but maybe not also. So question from Chitra. Does the second wave explosion in Maharashtra come down to just people? No. I think I mentioned that. No. About half was people not following COVID guidelines, and about half was the new variant, B1.617, approximately. So it is a combination of the two. RVS Ramakrishna, are powers that be seeking scientific technical advice and abiding by them? They are occasionally seeking technical advice. Abiding by them, well, I wouldn't like to comment. So, yeah.
So to summarize, yeah, please go ahead. I think there's one more question you. Is there one more question?
I don't think so. I just say thank you very much. So that's all.
Okay. So to just summarize, from what I understand is there are 3 aspects to your model. One is the antibodies and how long will that last. Second, what's the rollout of the vaccination? And third, what is how long will the vaccinated people last? The antibodies of the vaccinated people last. Those are three variables will tell you this bump, instead of a peak, instead of a wave that we saw in the second wave. But there could be a bump. And what you're currently saying is it could be about 9 months based on what you have understood from Italy and Finland. And you're saying that this could happen.
No, the reason why I said 8 months is because if you look at the US and UK waves, the gap was hardly 2-3 months. And we could explain that by the fact that the reach was very low at the end of one wave and jumped to trigger the second wave. As I mentioned, the UK second wave, they had 3 waves. The most deadly one was the third one. At the end of the second wave, their reach was not even 40%. But in our case, the reach is about 70%, 73%, if you remember. So we should not have a reach-triggered third wave. We should have a third wave triggered by loss of immunity, non-availability of vaccination, and I keep repeating, people discarding COVID guidelines. Let us not underestimate that.
On that,
so
on that note, on that note, is there any so because that requires modeling of social behavior, because after people let down their guard, and that's a very natural to be constant state of alert is not a possible human behavior. So we cannot blame people for letting down their guard because they have to go about their normal lives. So is there any modeling on how people cannot stay at a high state of awareness always, and therefore they let down their guard at a particular time, and therefore that also is a variable in your model? That's a social
It's very
behavior.
natural. We're doing that because that so-called beta parameter, which is the contact rate, remember I said that it jumped by a factor of 60%. And laboratory experiments show that the Indian mutant contributes about 30% of that. So the other 30% came down from people letting down their guard. So what we can do is to say, all right, people start behaving foolishly. So beta may not go by 30% because some semblance of sense may still be there. It goes up by 20% because people start relaxing. Remember, people were having weddings, they were having birthday parties, they were having all kinds of stuff. So even if people don't wear masks in the grocery shops and all that, that is not comparable to what we had in December, January timeframe. Now, that was the level of carelessness which I don't think we'll see. So what we can do is, and we are thinking about doing it, we'll increase beta by 20%, wherever it is. And which, by the way, is what we did for the lockdown easing. The simulations we showed, what will happen if Telangana eases the lockdown, what will happen if Delhi eases lockdown. That's really the best solution, is just increase beta. That's kind of like a one-stop shop. It's a combination of all kinds of factors, but it simulates what can happen. So I agree with your basic comment. You cannot tell people to be in this ridiculous state of lockdown forever and ever. Psychologically, it's not possible, and economically, it is not possible.
Economically, it's not.
So I think that we have to allow some amount of economic activity, and if that causes some breaking out of the disease, I think the correct solution is not to clamp down, but to be prepared for it. In other words, so one thing we have done is to make forecasts for how many oxygen beds, how many ICU beds. Okay, and typically a pretty good formula which has held true across the country is when we predict a certain number of cases. Remember, if you remember T and U, T was tested positive and U was the undetected. Well, the undetected don't need any facilities. No, they're just, they don't need anything. They don't need bed, they don't need oxygen, nothing. Among the T, we found that about 20% are requiring hospitalization. And among those, about 15% require oxygen, around 5% require ICU. And so if you remember, the army was putting together all these field hospitals, and they used this formula to great effect. So in other words, in principle, if some state wants to take our predictions and say, okay, we want to be ready, what do you recommend by way of facilities? I say simple formula, just have this many beds ready, this many oxygen beds, this many ICU, and you should be fine. Now, oxygen supply is a separate thing. We're not getting into that at all. We're just talking about the requirement of beds.
Thank you very much, Vidyasagar Garu. It was truly wonderful. And we
okay, thank you.
Much richer listening to you. And we hope the bump, as you said, the bump is also small and we go through it. And let's hope sense prevails and we all take good care of ourselves to make sure that the bump remains a bump and not a peak and another way.
Yeah, that's what we hope. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Truly wonderful.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vidyasagar.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, Hari. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.